following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
The idea of indexing the blockchain and making a lot of that data accessible, easily to developers in a way that wasn't possible before, I think that's a game changer.
GRTiQ podcast.
We are like astronauts, floating in the space of time.
Welcome to the GRTiQ podcast. Today I'm speaking with Ayoola John, or AJ for short, the CEO and co-founder of Astronaut, a groundbreaking AI assistant tailored for community managers. As you're about to hear, in addition to creating a powerful new AI-based tool that enables greater community engagement and insight, AJ has a diverse professional background, spanning from time working at several multinational corporations in the energy sector, as well as stints at tech giants like Facebook and Coinbase. During this interview, AJ provides a fascinating insight into his journey from his upbringing in Lagos, Nigeria, to pursuing education and career opportunities in the United States. We also talk about AJ's entrepreneurial mindset, the key lesson he learned from his experience working at Facebook, and the impact he made while working at Coinbase on Coinbase Wallet. And toward the end of the conversation, AJ makes an incredible connection to a prior guest of the GRTiQ podcast that longtime listeners are sure to enjoy. In addition to joining today's podcast and sharing his story, AJ and the team at Astronaut have created a special discount code for anyone interested in trying Astronaut, so be sure to visit the show notes for a special discount code for GRTiQ podcast listeners. As always, we start the conversation by talking about AJ's educational background.
Yeah, so I originally was born in Lagos, Nigeria. So I went to sort of early education as well as a part of high school in Nigeria, a very different system, and moved to the States, to Houston for high school. And for college, I also studied in Houston. I studied petroleum and mechanical engineering. So pretty unconventional to now be working in software, but that's my background.
AJ, well, this might be a surprise to you. It's certainly not a surprise to longtime listeners that I've had the opportunity to interview a lot of people from Lagos, and there are a lot of graph advocates and people participating in the graph ecosystem from that part of the world. So I got to ask, what's going on in Lagos? This seems like a tech hub that sometimes people gloss over or don't quite notice. What can you tell us about that place?
So, I was born there. I grew up there. I think the best way I describe Lagos is it's like, think about New York City, but like the African version of it. Because Lagos is really that. It's like this confluence of all types of people, all types of culture. There's a hustle and bustle. You can feel it as soon as you get there. There's in recent years, there's also been this emergence of tech. And I think with Web3, Lagos is actually one of those hubs where a lot of what happens there sort of cascades to neighboring countries, especially in West Africa. Another place that's interesting is Ghana. I was just in Accra last year, and I also saw that energy of there's a lot of people on the ground participating in Web3 conferences and talks on a Thursday midday. And even though I haven't been to Nigeria in the last couple of years, I've heard it's even more intense in Nigeria. And so my plan is actually to go out there this year to check it out.
Have you ever thought about what makes these areas primed for participation in tech and maybe even more specifically Web3? If we were social scientists and we were just trying to figure out what the characteristics are that create a fertile area for this type of activity, what would you say makes it so in places like Ghana or Lagos?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think there's something to do with being a coastal city. I think about in America, right? There's when you think about what are the cities that you really want to go out and hustle and grind and make it, it's New York, LA, SF, right? These are coastal cities. And I think Lagos sort of falls nicely into that bucket where it's it's definitely a center of trade and commerce, and it's coastal, and it's a good lifestyle, quality of life. And so I can totally see that playing into it. Like, if it's a great place to settle, then it's probably a great place to settle for really talented people. And if it's a great place to settle for really talented people, then like chances that innovation is going to happen is like really high. And so to me, that's how you create the right environment for a tech hub and ecosystem.
Well, I think Web3 clearly unlocks a ton of innovation, and we're talking today because of a project that you've recently launched. But when it comes to things that we'll see further down the road in the years ahead, I really believe like the continent of Africa is going to be activated in a way that'll take an incredible presence on the world stage relating to Web3 and tech. And so I'm super excited. I always get that positive vibe when I have the opportunity to speak with people familiar with that part of the world. When it comes back to your education, what were you envisioning doing following university with those degrees?
Yeah, it's funny because like my goal has always been to work on computers, actually. So growing up in Nigeria, like I was one of those people that like, very early, I didn't really have access to much compute or anything like that. I would like tear anything I could get my hands on apart, radio, cassette players, like disc players, DVD players. I would just tear it down, try to tinker, try to figure out what's in it, take out the rotors, try to build my own like little robotics project. And so I was always kind of doing that. When I was young. I taught myself how to code at 13. I made my first website was like, I made an online forum for like Africans interested in tech. And so that was like my first like sort of foray into like building community online, but it was very much how I learned how to code. And so I always kind of knew I wanted to work on computers. And then I had the fortune of immigrating to the United States. And for me, like going from like growing up in Nigeria to like, to being in the United States was very big difference, right? Like I was actually attending a public school in Houston, but like I had a library and it was big and there was like a football stadium. And like, I didn't have any of that going to a private school in Nigeria. And so like, for me, I guess like, I was so grateful for the opportunity to go to school in the States. I was just like, you know what, this is great. Like, I'm just going to go to the University of Houston. I'll stay close to my family. And, a part of that was like, I was kind of naive, right? Like, I didn't really understand how the education system worked. And like, some schools are better for some things. And so I actually enrolled in college with a computer engineering degree. And then very quickly, I realized, oh my God, like if I wanted to study computer engineering, I probably should have gone to like Stanford. I should go to, a different city that was sort of more prime for that. And so I had to like do a on the fly pivot. I was like, okay, well, like I'm in Houston, like what is Houston the best at? And it just so happened to be energy. And, Nigeria is like a top energy producer. And so I was already used to that ecosystem. I understood like the value of energy and how core it was to civilization. And so I just changed my major and studied petroleum engineering and sort of just kept coding on the side.
I'm curious what it was like going from Lagos and then coming to the United States. What was your first impressions of the US and what was that experience like?
Oh, well, it's a very, very interesting question. I mean, there's a lot of things I could touch on that were very jarring to me. One of the things, since we're on the topic of like talking about sort of like society as a whole, like one of the things that was really, really surprising to me was the concept of like racism. And like, I say this to say because I don't think people really realize, but like the idea of like racism or looking at like people with certain skin color, like, like specifically like, looking at black people and saying, oh, like, I don't like black people. Like that was something that was very foreign to me because like growing up in Nigeria, right? Like everyone was black and, the president was black, the billionaires were black, like it's like there was no concept of like, oh, I'm less than in my head. And it wasn't until I actually moved to the States where I realized like, oh my God, like because of my skin color, I might be perceived a certain way. So I need to sort of be cognizant of that. And one of the things I ended up doing was I ended up minoring in African American studies just to understand the history a bit more and to understand this, like just the context of how we ended up with like a concept of racism in the United States. But I will say this like very honestly, like in Nigeria growing up, I didn't even that concept never crossed my mind.
Well, as someone that's from the United States, born and raised here, obviously deeply disappointed that was one of the experiences you had. But I'd be incredibly naive not to note that these types of tensions have existed for a long time. And in fact, in recent years, I would say have kind of reemerged. And so terribly sorry that was your experience. What did you learn by virtue of kind of going through that experience? I mean, was that an educational thing that you've kind of taken with you?
For me, it was 100% a learning experience. Once again, like I was born on the continent, like my whole identity was being African. And so moving to the States and then, being considered African-American, I started to understand the nuance of that, where it's like, there's an African-American identity that's actually different from an African identity. I didn't even like know that was a thing, but it is true because, when you think about the typical African American, like, a lot of them are, descendants of slaves, and these slaves like come from Africa, which is where I'm from as well. Right. And so for me, my ancestry is like, oh, like I was born in Nigeria, like so is my father, so is my grandfather. And like, I kind of know where they are. I know the village they're from. Like I go there from time to time every year. And that's my experience and identity as an African, right? And then you meet like an African American and like a true like African American, and their identity is like, hey, like I was born in this city, my grandmother was a slave, and it's like, whoa, that's a very different life experience to have. It's a very different ancestry. It's a very different identity to have, and so it gave me a lot of empathy. I think I've had the opportunity to really like experience what it's like to not like, for me, I honestly don't wake up feeling less than. I wake up feeling just fine. Like, my grandfather was a king in my village. Like, I feel like I'm a prince. Like, I have this like natural audacity where I've come to really gain a lot of empathy for people that don't, just because like, if your grandmother was a slave or your grandfather was a slave, like that just creates a different type of trauma. It's really hard to work through. And if you spend the time like really studying slavery and what came out of it, like it's just hard not to empathize with that. And so for me, I've spent a lot of effort like really trying to understand like the African American context and history. And also I've also found ways, and we could talk about that later, to contribute back, and just, because at the end of the day, like in America, that's my identity. I'm an African American. And so I really just own that and try to do what I can to push sort of the narrative to a more positive place.
Appreciate you sharing some of these things. And again, I'm deeply embarrassed and disappointed that this is part of the American story, and grateful for you to share their voice, to share this perspective. Going back then to your education and your experience as a student, you took on a bunch of internships. And when I was looking up your profile, I thought that was inspiring, somebody out there trying different things. And so talk to us about the strategy you had in trying all these different internships and what you learned through those experiences.
Yeah. So I interned at Shell Oil Corporation, BP, Goldman Sachs, Core Zero, ExxonMobil. And really what I was trying to achieve there was I was trying to learn and understand. I think very early on, luckily for me, very early on, I got the sense that like a lot of people, there was this narrative that like you had to sort of like get a job and just stick at the job and stay there long term. There was that narrative going. And then there was this other thing I was experiencing where like, you would talk to recruiters, you'd be like, yeah, I love my job. This company is so great. And you get there and the company's not quite as great. And so I realized like the only way for me to know for sure if like that job description was actually great, and like for sure if that company was actually great, it's probably not to talk to the recruiters at the company. And I don't entirely trust the employees either, because they're all incentivized to convince me that the company is great. And so my strategy was then like, okay, I'm going to take the time I have and I'm just going to try as many companies as I can and try as many roles as I can, because that gave me a firsthand account of like, what is this company actually like? And what is this role actually like? And the result of that is like, I gained a very like good understanding of like how different companies operate, like how distinct different this, there could be two companies in the same industry doing the same thing, but they couldn't be more different culturally and in the way they approach business. And that gave me a lot of perspective. And one perspective I didn't realize I would really understand is just like the perspective of how like literally two companies can be doing the exact same thing, but very, very differently. And that taught me a lot. And I take that a lot, like in my journey going forward. And the other thing that I really appreciate from that experience is I got to gain a lot of skills, especially around like, I can be talking to you about software and I can use an analogy in like how you drill wells in East Texas. And surprisingly, like those analogies actually work. But because I've seen how to drill wells and I've seen how to write software, I can make connections that a lot of people can't make. And so I've also found a lot of value in that.
So your advice to somebody that's listening to this podcast, that's a young person, maybe still in university, would it be take as many internships as you can? This is good strategy?
100%. I think, that's what I did because I think it was the optimal strategy. Just try different internships, try different companies out, see for yourself, like find out what you actually enjoy, what you're good at. And there's no better way to find it out than just like doing it.
Let's talk then about what you did after these internships. In 2018, you decided to start your first startup. And again, we're talking today because you're working on another one, but you become sort of an entrepreneur at this point in your life. Talk to us about 2018. What did you start and what was the vision there?
Yeah, so I was saying earlier how when I moved to America, I learned about the African American experience, which was very foreign to me as a Nigerian African. And so I took it upon myself to study like African American history. I minored in it in college. And a lot of what I learned really led me to like want to make a difference in the community and like actually do something. And so I started a company that was focused on upskilling underrepresented students and professionals and placing them in like high paying, high impact jobs. And so what I did there was like literally just start this like online learning platform and built a community around it of tens of thousands of underrepresented students and professionals, raised about $1 million in grants from the top companies, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, those companies, and then placed hundreds of students and young professionals directly in those jobs. And that was the impact I had at Blademy, and it was directly related to me learning about sort of what disadvantages the community had and trying to figure out how I can make a difference.
Talk to us about what you learned about business and entrepreneurship. So this was your first kind of foray into it. What did you learn about what makes a good entrepreneur or what makes a good startup?
Let's say I was very naive. I that company, I was like, it was 100% like mission focused. Like I just had a specific mission I was trying to solve. And so I just kind of, like in retrospect, like ignorance is bliss, right? Because I didn't overthink it. I just started a company, recruited my friends, and we just started working at it. We built a very organic community. We spent $0 on marketing. And we had a lot of reach and a lot of impact. But two key lessons I learned, in terms of mistakes I made, in that business venture that I vowed never to make again is one, like, it's not the best business strategy to just like hire your smartest friends. Like you actually have to like think about the kind of company you want to build, and you need to figure out like who are the experts at building that kind of company, and you need to go hire those people because your friends might not actually be very good at the thing the company needs. And so that was like first thing, very important lesson. The other thing I learned is the importance of like shared equity. So at my last startup, I actually had most of the equity because it was my idea and like I recruited my co-founded team. But in my new startup, I split it 50-50 with my co-founder, and I realized like, and I'll talk about this a bit more, but I ended up realizing that the dominant strategy is actually to just have a 50-50 partner, someone that like can be equally accountable, equally responsible, and equally incentivized. And I think, so far from my experience with this new company, I think it just works way better because it's never a question of like how committed is the other person or is the person doing more. It's like just very clear, like we're equally committed, we're equally invested, and like you have to carry your own weight. And I think it really makes a difference in terms of like just the quality of like output you can generate. And so those are two key lessons I learned, and those are two things I've implemented in my new company.
Well, what makes a successful entrepreneur then? What's the characteristic, the one or two characteristics that makes somebody at least have a chance at being a successful entrepreneur?
Yeah, I think leadership is important. And when I talk about leadership, for me at least, I think about leadership as like being a servant. It's like, I think about my team. Like if there's someone on my team that's like, coding or something and they're hungry, like I will walk to the store and buy them food, right? Like, because like I think my job is to really like empower people and unblock them. And like, I should be the one to face the hardest problems and to like, to do the most annoying things, like it's a sacrifice I feel like I have to make to just like empower the team. And I think, so for me, I think leadership is really important. And that comes, leadership like covers like being very clear with communication, like facing your own personal insecurities, like watching how you communicate, manage your emotions, like all of those things really, really funnel down to leadership. But I think it's critical. I think a good place to really like experience leadership at its most intensity is like, like study like military generals and how they command people to literally go to the battlefield and die. Like that is like, to me, that's like, how could you do that? Like, how can you convince another human being to go die? Like they must really believe in your mission. And so I think that's what great leadership ends up looking like at its extreme. And so that's one. The other thing that I think makes a great entrepreneur is just like sheer grit. Like you have to just like wake up every day and realize like, oh my God, like this is hard. This is extremely hard. I honestly don't want to do this. But like I will. And, just kind of like just doing it. Like it's not an easy journey. It's very brutal. But like if you're willing to just get up every day and just do the work, I think you end up making a great entrepreneur.
So what happened to Blademy then? How's that story go?
Yeah, so the story goes, we built this community. We had tens of thousands of students and young professionals excited about what we're doing. They were taking our courses, we were placing them in jobs and internships. And I was like, I started thinking, well, as a businessman, like I want to really scale the impact here and like make this, very big. We're having a lot of companies that are reaching out to us, wanting to hire our, people from our community. And so I figured, well, maybe I could build like a LinkedIn, like a sort of a marketplace of talent where our students and our professionals could sort of upload their CV, take some courses and showcase that on our platform. And recruiters can just sidestep LinkedIn and just come straight to us and recruit directly. There was also at that time, diversity and equity and inclusion in corporate hiring was like a big trend. And so really, I saw an opportunity to really tap into that and make an impact that way. But we actually couldn't build the platform. We didn't have the talent on the team to build the platform. So just like engineering prowess on the team. And, this goes back to my lesson earlier. Once again, you don't want to hire smart friends. You want to hire surgical experts. And so once I realized that we didn't have the right team to actually build like a product at that level, and frankly, I didn't know enough about what it took to build a product at that level, I shut the company down and went to Facebook.
So that's an important chapter here that we're going to explore. So after Blademy, you just articulated there that it didn't work and you decided to shut it down. But instead of landing somewhere unknown, you land at Facebook, arguably one of the biggest and most well-known brands in the world. And you go to work as a product manager there. Talk to us about how that came to be and what you did there at Facebook.
Yeah, so the way I really got in, I mean, Facebook is notoriously hard to get into, especially as a product manager. But what I did, I think that the key thing here is like, at least what I've learned about the way the world works is like, you want to demonstrate like capacity. Like people wouldn't just take your word for it. People want to see, like I guess in the crypto lingo, it's like, you proof of work, right? You got to prove that you're good at it. So what I did was I realized, okay, I'm living in Houston. I'm a petroleum engineer. Obviously I know how to code. I understand. I've taught myself design. I know how to do software stuff, right? So I knew I was like capable to excel at Facebook. I was like, if I was going to do this, I want to do this at the highest level. I wanted to learn from the best. I wanted to work with the best. I want to work on the biggest products because that's how I felt like I would learn. I would become the best. And so I knew I wanted to go to Facebook, but I kind of figured like they probably just wouldn't hire me directly. So what I did was I took advantage of like my existing network. At that time, I already interned at all the energy companies. I knew a lot of executives because I had excelled at those different internships. And so I connected with the CTO at Chevron. And Chevron is like a multinational like oil and gas company. And at that time, they just hired a new CEO who was like really, bullish on technology and like he was leading a digital transformation. So I was able to find a role there as a product manager leading a large team with a budget of $30 million a year. And the idea there was to build AI software for drilling and supply chain management that would then return $1 billion of value to the company. And so this was a role I sort of just like created, through relationships, got in there. And it was from that experience I was able to demonstrate that like, hey, I can like lead a big operation and create like $1 billion of value for an enterprise. And so I then, spent some time at Chevron, packaged up that experience and then shared it with Facebook and then they hired me.
And what did you work on there? What were you the product manager of?
At Facebook, so I worked on a few things actually. One of the things that was very cool that I got to work on was Novi. So Novi at the time was like this Project Libra Facebook had started. It was led by David Marcus, who was the former CEO of PayPal. And so like he was my boss. And what we were trying to build, we were trying to build a crypto payments app essentially. And so that was the first product I got to work on. I worked with a lot of the folks that are now at Sui and Aptos. So the Sui and Aptos team really came from that core team at Facebook. And so I got to work on that, which was fun. And then we had a lot of challenges with that. The biggest challenge was launching a crypto app at Facebook was challenging because like government, and Facebook is really big. Facebook has 3 billion people logging in every day. And so a lot of governments were really scared about Facebook launching its own token or its own sort of crypto app because a lot of governments were scared that like Facebook was big enough to be, like a real threat to their democracy and national interests. And so we found a lot of pushback from regulators. And so that's why the team ended up shutting down and some of the team went and started Aptos and Sui. And I ended up moving to other divisions in the company. So after I left Novi, I worked on the feed and the stories product. So Facebook Stories, Facebook Feed. I also was on the team that launched Reels, which is now being used by multiple billion people on Instagram and Facebook.
The GRTiQ podcast is made possible by a generous grant from the Graph Foundation. The Graph Grants program provides support for protocol infrastructure, tooling, dApps, subgraphs, and community building efforts. Learn more at the Graph.Foundation. That's the Graph.Foundation.
Hi, this is GRTiQ. As I said at the start of today's episode, AJ and the team at Astronaut have created a special discount code for listeners of the GRTiQ podcast. So if you or your community would like to receive a special offer and experience the advantages of having AI guide you toward greater community engagement and insight, then be sure to visit the show notes for your special discount code. Thanks for listening. AJ, you've clearly had the opportunity to kind of get to know and network and work with some C-level people in various industries. Is there an insight there about one characteristic, habit, or quality that you learned about people that sort of operate at that level in these different industries with these multinational firms? Is there an insight there about what they're like, or a hack of people that aspire to do that?
Yeah. So executives, specifically executives at multinational corporations, I'm honestly impressed by them. Like, I don't know how they do it. Like, I still haven't figured it out because they have so much work to do, so many people to manage. I mean, these people manage tens of thousands of people across multiple like geographies, across multiple languages, across multiple business divisions, and somehow they still have 15 minutes to chat with me. Like, it totally blows my mind. I don't know how they've done it, because I'm right now managing a team of like 6 or 7 people at my little startup. And I barely have time. And so I think what they've probably mastered that I need to get better at is just like delegation, like it's just a really effective delegation and like trusting your people, like, wholeheartedly. And also I think another thing that's really underrated when you need to operate at that scale is you need really good systems and processes to give people like a North Star to work towards, but also have a system to evaluate their performance. And I think that's something these executives have gotten really good at that I think I can learn from.
Was it hard to go from entrepreneur to big Web 2 firm like Facebook? Was that a hard transition for you to make?
It had its challenges, but it's exactly what I needed. Here's what I mean. I mean, when I went to Facebook, for example, I mean, I really got to learn what I realized how naive I was when it came to building products. Because you can imagine Facebook literally has a product that's like half of the planet logs into Facebook every single day, right? So like, you launch a feature and you launch it, and then the next week there's 1 billion people using it, right? It's a very different rigor to product development, very intense rigor to shipping software, to testing software, to trying out different product ideas. In that whole system, that process of repeatedly creating great products that Facebook has really mastered is what I got to learn and experience firsthand. And honestly, there's no other way I would have learned that information, because there's only like a handful of companies on the planet that have a product that is used by 1 billion people every day, right? There's only like Facebook and Google and maybe a couple others that have that kind of scale. And so really getting to experience that and the rigor of thinking that goes into delivering a product like that shaped everything for me, because I realized, oh my God, this is all the things like I thought I knew at the startup that I obviously didn't know. These are where I was naive. And I took a lot of those lessons. I think everything I'm ever going to do in the tech world, for forever is going to be thanks to what I learned at Facebook, honestly.
And I'm curious to know, did they have a templated system for rolling out something like that? Like it was just something off the shelf, or was each product launch a little bit idiosyncratic?
There was a whole system. I mean, like, for example, I can give you some context, right? So let's say, you're a product manager, you have an idea for, a new feature or a new product, and you had this, strategy first. Like there's a whole review process. You got to like, create the idea, create the story, make it compelling. You got to sell it to the team, right? So then you get the team, you got to get, the engineers bought in, right? Like what I experienced at Facebook was a lot of the engineers, they're a bit of mercenaries in a way. They could just go work on another team if your idea is not as exciting. And so you have to make sure your idea is exciting. It's like being a mini like entrepreneur within the company. You got to make sure your idea is exciting. You got to like tell the story. Then you got to pitch it to the higher ups to like fund it. They got to hire engineers. Facebook engineers are very expensive. They make $300,000 to $700,000, but you want like 8 of them, right? So you got to get somebody to like, allocate those engineers to you. And then once you get that done, like there's a lot of gates. So you got to do privacy reviews, legal reviews, just because, Facebook has a lot of surface area. And obviously there's a lot of like legal threats. And so you got to like go through all those processes. And these are not good things. They're good from the sense that like, you want to hold a company that big accountable to doing the right thing. But from like a entrepreneur trying to build the cool new idea, like it's really tough and really challenging because you have this great idea, but then the lawyer says you can't ship it. And then that's that, and so that I think that's the pro was we were very diligent at every step of creating a product. But the con is that a lot of great ideas don't end up getting out because, there are privacy concerns or legal concerns. And I think that's why big companies fail to really innovate as well as startups do.
AJ, as you know, Facebook is often kind of enemy number one when it comes to the sins of Web 2, if you will. Is it fair, all the vitriol that Facebook gets on occasion?
I think criticism is always like welcome and fair. I think a company that big must be criticized because if you have half the planet, and this is a big deal, like if you have half the planet logging into your app every day, I hope you get criticized like every day as well, because like that's a lot of power. And with that should come a lot of responsibility and a lot of accountability. And so I'm grateful for all the criticism. I will say like working there also gave me another perspective. It gave me an empathy for the kind of work people do there and like how much people actually try their hardest to solve these problems. Some of these problems are just really challenging. I can tell you like the last team I worked on before I left Facebook was the content moderation team. And we actually had an army of 40,000 people that just sat there looking at like content that the AI couldn't really figure out and make sure that like bad content doesn't get shown to users. That's a big investment. 40,000 people just sitting there, but things still like slip through the cracks. And so whenever something slips through the cracks, like people get like riled up and, but like, I wish people saw the amount of effort that's actually going in and just realize like a lot of these problems are hard. Like when somebody tweets something, there is a faction that says, oh, you gotta take that down. That's, especially political rhetoric. Oh, you gotta take that down. That's bad. That's a bad thing to say. Right. And then there's another camp that's saying, oh, you gotta keep that up. That's a good thing to say. Right. And so as the platform, like, what do? You can't actually please anybody. It's sort of like you're caught between a rock and a hard place. And I got to really experience that firsthand because like when I was in the seat, like I also didn't know what to do. Like, do I delete it or do I not delete it? And so I think it's a genuine hard problem. But I think the right answer is still just to like keep the intense criticism going because then we can ensure at least we have a shot at like tackling these hard problems, but they're really hard.
So you're born in Lagos, you come to the United States, you do a little bit of studying, you get some incredible internships, meet some people, you become an entrepreneur, launch your first venture. That doesn't work out. You go to work at Facebook. You just shared some of the incredible experiences and insights you had there. Somewhere along that path, you become aware of or interested in crypto. Take us back in time. When was that? And tell us what your first impressions were.
I got interested in crypto in college. And I remember specifically, it was XRP. So this was probably, I think, sometime in 2015. A bunch of my friends were talking about like XRP to the moon, like XRP, Ripple. And I'm thinking like, what is that? Like, what are y'all talking about? And prior to this, my only other exposure was like, when I was young, I told you I was teaching myself how to code. I was very curious. I tried a bunch of different things. And one of the rabbit holes I went down was like understanding how Tor worked and understanding how like these like the dark web worked. And so I had spent some time just like scrolling through the dark web, trying to understand what that whole community is like, what the technology is like over there. And so I had encountered Bitcoin because I think a lot of people were using Bitcoin to buy drugs and, do illegal things on the Silk Road. And so I was never going to touch Bitcoin with a 10-foot pole, right? Because like I was a good kid, I was not buying drugs. So my initial experience of crypto was like, oh, that's something you should never touch, right? Because like that can get you in trouble. And so fast forward, many years later, I was in college. My friends are talking about XRP, and I was like, okay, what is that? Okay, I want to buy. My friends are buying it. I want to buy it too. And I remember it being like really, really hard to buy. Like I had to jump through so many hoops to like buy XRP. And it took me like a whole day just to figure it out. But finally I had some XRP. And then it was something like maybe like a week later, like this thing is like going up. Like I invested like $25 and I was up like, 1,000%. Now I had 250. I was like, oh my God, this is crazy. This is incredible. Obviously I was relatively broke then, but that's what really got me interested, right? Because like, I told you about my background. I interned at Goldman Sachs. Like I was on track to being a trader. That was like my intended profession. And so I was already competitive. I was already excited about markets, and this was a new kind of market, and I was actually winning. And so after that, I just, I spent a lot of attention learning more about the ecosystem. I didn't really understand crypto though. Even though I was buying tokens, I didn't really understand it. What really clicked for me was Ethereum. When I first read the Ethereum white paper, that's when I had my aha moment. Like, oh my God, it's a computer. It's a decentralized computer. That's what did it for me. As soon as I discovered that, I literally remember having this light bulb moment thinking, oh my God, this changes everything. And that's when I started to pursue like actual professional work in the space.
This is a very common story on the GRTiQ podcast. It starts with a little bit of interest in the speculative nature of the tokens, and then Ethereum comes along and there's this unlock about utility. Why is a distributed computer something that you read and kind of discovered in Ethereum? Why is that something that caused you to say, oh, this is something different, this is important?
Yeah, because like before Ethereum, I never really thought about that. The idea is like traditionally when you think about like computers, right? They are typically owned by somebody. It's like on somebody's machine, you run a piece of code, and really what's happening is like the machine is just updating its state, right? It's a state machine, right? And the idea that like you can have a computer that's not owned by anyone, you can publish any code to, and the code runs, theoretically forever. I was like, okay, so you could actually write a piece of code, maybe even anonymously, you can publish it to the blockchain, and like that code will continue to run forever. Like that just blew my mind. Like, what? I've never seen anything like that. I've never heard of anything like that. And I didn't immediately know how that would work. But then that's when I started diving into the rabbit hole. I started to learn about these new ideas. Like at the time, like one of the interesting ideas at the time was like this idea of a lossless lottery. A lot of early DeFi conversations starting to happen. So I'm starting to see some of those ideas. And all I could like spend all my brain power on was like trying to think about like what other things could you do with such a technology. And I think that's the story of Web3. Even to this day, it's like a lot of people see the potential, and a lot of people are really trying to figure out like, what can you really do with this? And I think that's where we are still.
So talk to us about what you did after Facebook. What happened next, and how did you get to where you are now?
Yeah, so after Facebook, I consciously left Facebook. I think I got to the point where I felt like, okay, I went to Facebook specifically to learn how to build product at the highest level, because my startup had failed because I couldn't build the product I needed to build. And so I wanted to learn from the best, like how does the best, software building company, how do they do it? I go there, I study sort of what they did. I learned from who I would consider some of the best people in the tech industry. And once I got to a point where I felt like I learned sufficiently, I wanted to hold myself accountable to actually going back out there and like pursuing my dreams as an entrepreneur. So I figured I couldn't just kind of go to start a company. I guess I could have, but I had limited beliefs. And so I decided that maybe a good strategy would be to join another fast growing like early stage startup so I can learn firsthand what it's like to run a venture backed startup. And that's exactly what I did. So when I left Facebook, I joined a social media early stage startup. It was venture backed by Lightspeed Ventures. We'd raised like $6 million. And so I joined as head of product. And so I was like number 2 at the company, really driving the strategy and driving the product. And we ended up growing that to a top 50 app on the App Store. It was ranked above Twitter and Clubhouse at its peak. And so from that experience, I really got to take a lot of what I learned at Facebook, but apply it to like a much, with less resources, a smaller team. And also I was able to be more creative. Like I was traveling across the country we're building this social app for Gen Z. And so I was traveling across the country, throwing parties at college campuses, like, really breaking into the fraternity networks and things like that, because, those things directly correlated with retention and engagement on our product. And it just taught me, like, that experience was really just like, hey, here's what it's like when you have a startup, you're running a startup, you have a growth target, you have very little resources, and the pressure is on because you know exactly when you're going to die as a company if you don't like figure it out. And that's what I did. The company was called Faves. And so, yeah, that was that experience. And I really enjoyed it. It was really fun. Ultimately, I decided to leave. And the reason why I decided to leave Faves was the bull market was back, right? So the crypto bull market was back. And I was like, I was working on the product and it was going well. But at the same time, I was like, once again, back to my trading background, I'm very good at markets. And so like, I just, in my free time, I was like trading NFTs. And I got to the point in the bull market where I was making like $5,000 a day, just like flipping NFTs. And, OpenSea was at its peak. Blur had just launched. Like there was a big NFT bull market. So I had this whole strategy down where, every day I was printing about $5,000 a day. And I figured, well, like if I'm so interested in this and I'm so good at this, like why not just commit to it? Why not just go full Web3, like become, just go into the industry, stop sidestepping, just go full in. And that's what I did. So I left Faves and I joined Coinbase as a product manager. And I changed my Twitter handle to Web3AJ and I just kind of went all in.
This is a person who went from Facebook, had a short stop at Faves, and then went to work at Coinbase. What was that experience like? What was it like going to work at Coinbase?
It was incredible. Coinbase is, in my experience, was a great place to work. I was specifically working on Coinbase Wallet. And what was interesting about Coinbase Wallet, it was like, it was a very lean team, very, very efficient team, very lean, it felt kind of like a startup in a way. And it was great because I was just coming from a startup. So I had all the energy and intensity of a startup. When I joined, I was also given the autonomy that I needed. And so very quickly, was able to ship some really incredible products. Like I shipped the first blockchain transaction simulation, like on the EVM transaction simulation on Popular Wallet. So if you use Coinbase Wallet today, you notice like it like simulates your transaction and tells you how many tokens are leaving and how many tokens are coming in. Yeah, that was my feature. And so I got to ship that. I shipped a lot of really like a lot of those safety warnings you get on the wallet. Like those were features I shipped with my team. And so I got to work on really incredible things really quickly. And with a really, 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 really great team, I really enjoyed it. I was there just last year. I left Coinbase 7 months ago specifically to start my new company because I finally thought the time was right for me to get back into being an entrepreneur. But I really loved my experience at Coinbase.
How did working at Coinbase, perhaps the primary flag carrier for the entire industry, at least in the United States, how did that shift your perspective about Web3 and the industry as a whole?
I'll tell you one thing that, so when I first joined Coinbase, I was working on, I was leading the safety team. I was also working on, the wallet, like just like think of like how you like do transactions on the blockchain and how you store your crypto and things like that, which is all great. And then, because I was really successful at that and launched some really incredible features, then I started focusing on the NFT, started leading the NFT team on Coinbase Wallet. And very quickly, what I realized at that time, I had already made a lot of friends in the NFT space because I was a DJ myself. And so I contacted all my friends like Frank from D Gods and all these people. And I was talking to them about like, hey, like, what's your vision for NFTs? I talked to a bunch of investors from A6Z Crypto and just trying to understand and learn from them. Like, okay, what can we build? And what I realized was no one knew what the future of NFTs were. Like no one actually had an idea. People just had these like speculations, opinions. Like you hear the typical thing like, oh, gaming, oh, this. But like no one had a concrete idea of what NFTs were going to be. And here I was leading the NFT team at like, one of the top crypto companies. And like, I was also unsure where NFTs were going. And internally, we weren't really sure either. And I think that's like a very big lesson I took away from that experience where as an entrepreneur, especially in this space, we're so early where your crazy ideas can actually work. Like if no one knows where the industry is going, then it means you can actually decide. Right. And so I think that's where I felt like, okay, if no one knows where the NFTs are going, then I felt, another person I got to talk to about NFTs when I was, I got to have lunch with Vitalik Buterin in Accra. And I also asked him about NFTs and he was like, yeah, like you have to figure out the user experience, because we're focused on the protocol. And I was like, oh my God, like this is really up to me and I don't know what to do. And so that's one experience I had that really got me thinking a lot about if we're so early, then maybe there's an opportunity to still like actually create something new and like push my vision. And that's what led me to ultimately just resign from Coinbase and start Astronaut because I felt like I had an idea for something that I could actually do tangibly in the space.
So let's talk about Astronaut. We've come full circle to where we are presently. And I appreciate that great backstory about you professionally and personally. Tell us what Astronaut is. What are the origins? Where did this idea come from?
So Astronaut is an AI assistant for community managers. So if you're running a Web3 project, whether you're the head of growth or the product manager or the community manager or the director of community, if you're the director of community, you probably want to retain the members in the community and like make sure they're having a great experience. You want to grow it. If you are a head of dev role, you probably want to attract a lot of developers and like retain them and make sure they're having a good experience. Same thing if you're running an NFT community, you kind of want to make sure the community is having a good experience. And so what Astronaut does is Astronaut enables you to do that at scale, right? So like you can answer questions like, hey, what does my community want from me right now? As opposed to spending a month doing surveys and asking the community. With Astronaut could just give you that answer in 3 seconds because Astronaut's already been like listening to what the community wants. If you launch a new feature to the community and you're thinking, well, what do people think about this new feature? Do people have ideas to improve this new feature? Once again, you can spend weeks like doing a survey and trying to figure it out, or you can just ask Astronaut because Astronaut's always listening to your community. And so Astronaut can tell you, hey, people actually really like this new feature. And those things in long term enable you to actually improve engagement with your community and like bring them closer to what your mission is. And ultimately, we enable you to grow your community to the maximum potential it can be. And so that's Astronaut. In terms of how I sort of got started working on it, I think it became very clear to me when I was at Coinbase because I was like literally leading this NFT team. I saw a lot of NFT projects come out, and I realized, because I was also part of a lot of these NFT communities, I realized like the thing that really held a lot of like I looked at what's different between the mediocre NFT project and the great NFT projects. And one thing that was very clear to me was the great NFT projects were just better at building community. They were just better at getting all their people on the same page. They were better at getting your people to evangelize them. Like they were just better at the community thing. And I realized, well, there's a lot of people with great ideas. There's a lot of project founders with great ideas. There's a lot of, blockchain founders with great ideas. And if only they knew how to like grow their community and engage their community to the same intensity and virality as like, a Bored Ape Yacht Club or, like a graph, right? Like if only they could do that, then maybe their idea actually has a good shot. And that's where the idea for Astronaut was born. I just saw this need and I felt like I knew the right technology and the right way to build a product that could help. And so I reached out to, I told you I was the head of product at Faves. I reached out to the head of engineering at the time. We had worked together and he was interested. And so we both quit our jobs and started working on Astronaut.
Was that a difficult move to make? You'd already been an entrepreneur once. It went well for a while and then you had to end it. You went to work at some really big Web2 firms and now you're back in the startup land, if you will. Hard to do?
Yeah, very hard to do. The biggest thing with quitting your job, I was really well paid at Coinbase and I was working on really interesting things and I really liked my team, right? And so I'm describing a situation where you're quitting something you love. And doing that, you're quitting something that you love and is comfortable. And the thing about that is like, that's the perfect opportunity for like fear, to be crippled by fear. And so I was very scared of leaving my job. I talked to my family about it. My mom was very concerned. My siblings were very concerned. But ultimately, like, I knew I had a great idea and I knew that like I had the skills necessary to execute it. I knew I had the relationships necessary to like see it through. And I felt like the biggest risk was not trying. And so that was my opportunity to demonstrate courage and just say, hey, I'm scared. I'm very scared to do this, but I would do it. And I did.
Incredible. And so if I have it right, then the target user for Astronaut is somebody that oversees or manages a community. So this would be like someone within an organization. The product itself is AI driven. It's listening to the community. I can get shortcuts to community sentiment. I mean, am I thinking about this correctly?
That's very correct. So you might wake up in the morning and think, well, I wonder what people in the graph community were talking about yesterday. You just ask Astronaut. Astronaut will tell you because Astronaut's already plugged into your Discord, your Telegram, your Slack, your Twitter. And Astronaut could just tell you, hey, here's what people were talking about. In fact, here's this person that made this really, really awesome post. You should totally check out. And all of a sudden, you're plugged right back into your community.
Amazing. I can see a ton of utility for it, especially in an ecosystem where posts on Discord, posts in forum, posts in Slack seem to grow exponentially. And so I'm sure there's a lot of demand for something like this. Why did you choose the name Astronaut? Where did you come up with some of that branding and for what you would call it?
So in terms of the name, my core ethos, my core mission as a person, like the thing that I really want to make a difference in this world is this idea of like bringing people together. So I think about my experience, growing up in Nigeria. It was a very communal experience. Like everyone on the street knew each other. I went to sleep with my doors open because if somebody came and robbed me, I would report them to their mom. Like I sort of like, we knew everybody. It was very communal. And moving to the States, it became like, it was very jarring from the sense of like, I didn't even know my neighbors. Like people didn't really talk to each other. I was very isolated. And you walk down the streets in a big city, there's homeless people sitting on the side of the road. We're conditioned to not even really care about them or where they're from. And so I think there's this like huge problem in the world of like, we're all human beings, yet we find ways to like hate each other and fight each other. There's wars going on. And I felt like if we all just like paused and took a step back and zoomed out into space, like, look from distant space and look at the Earth, at the end of the day, we're all just these like tiny people on a ball that's floating through space. We don't know where it's floating from. We don't know where it's floating through. But what we do know is that we are all on this ball called Earth, which really what it is, it's a spaceship, right? It's just this spaceship that's just flying through at rapid pace through space. And so I realized, like, when I distilled us down to our core essence, like, we're really just astronauts because we're on this spaceship floating through space. We don't know where we're going. We're really explorers at our heart. And I just realized, like, if we all could just see ourselves as what we are, just these astronauts on this spaceship, then we can all come to an acceptance that we're all the same. And these differences that we make up aren't really consequential. And I felt like that could be a good way to bring people together. And so that's where Astronaut comes from.
Thank you for sharing that. So listeners of the podcast don't know is that you and I met at the Graph's third birthday in San Francisco just last year. It was incredible to meet you there. It was a great turnout. What are your thoughts on the Graph? I mean, you were at the event. It seemed like you were pretty well networked. You knew a lot of people there. Do you have any thoughts on the Graph and kind of how it fits into Web3?
The Graph is a very fascinating like ecosystem and concept. I've gotten to learn even more about the Graph since I met you. I think the idea of like indexing the blockchain and making a lot of that data accessible, easily to developers in a way that wasn't possible before. I think that's a game changer because if you spend enough time in this space, you realize very quickly how many ecosystems they are and like how many different protocols exist and how many different projects they are. And like having someone that's like sitting there thinking, whoa, like how do you bring all this together and make it work for like a developer with limited resources? I think that's very powerful. That's speaking on the technology side. In terms of the ecosystem and the vibe, I mean, I live in San Francisco and there's the House of Web3. And when you go there, it's literally just like Web3 people. And that's a place where that's the only place I've actually found community of Web3 people in SF. And so I don't really have any other like big Web3 community in SF that I can tap into. And so I've also found a place of refuge with the Graph community. And I really appreciate that. And so I think that's something that like, if you're not in SF, you might not know, but it does exist. There is a House of Web3 that exists to help your community.
Yeah, anybody that lives in San Francisco that's listening to this definitely needs to head over to the House of Web3 and find that community. It's a great space. Another connection that we made as we were meeting each other at this event is that I interviewed Chika Uwazie, one of the founders of Afropolitan, on the podcast. And it's remarkable to me, the more podcast interviews I do, the different threads that attach people in this space. And you mentioned that you also have a link with Chika and Afropolitan. Remind me what that was and tell listeners about what's going on with Afropolitan.
Yeah, so Afropolitan has this vision of building a digital country, a network state, right? And the thesis is, well, like, if you look at how a lot of African countries are formed, they're formed through colonialism. So a lot of Europeans kind of colonized the countries in the continent and drew lines and like, oh, here's this country, here's that country, right? And so a lot of those lines were drawn across like boundaries where they shouldn't have been drawn, right? It could be like two ethnicities that hated each other were sort of put in the same country, right? And so that's the perfect storm for like creating conflict, geopolitical conflict. And so it's no surprise a lot of countries in Africa aren't doing too hot. And it's because a lot of these countries weren't created consciously. And so what Afropolitan's vision is like, okay, what if we create the first African country, but we create it consciously in the same way the United States of America was created? And I really, really love that vision. I think it's very interesting. I think it's audacious, but like, I think it just might work, right? And Afropolitan, one of their first investors was Blademy, who was a CTO of Coinbase, who wrote the book on network states. And so anyways, I've been very bullish on the project from day one. I actually own the Citizen Zero NFT. So the very first NFT they created, I own, and it's in a vault, never letting that go. And I do my best to contribute to the project as much as possible. I try to stay pretty involved. And I'm, obviously big fan of Chika and HA, also friends. I actually traveled to Ghana with them last year. So it's a great community, great people. And I look at them as like my older siblings.
I'll put links in the show notes for information about Astronaut, as well as a link to that interview with Chika if anybody wants to go back and listen to that. We explore the idea and kind of the roots of Afropolitan and how that emerged. And super cool to meet you and to make the connection that you are a member of that. And I'm very, very bullish on the things that are happening within that community. I want to ask you kind of one final question before I ask you the GRTiQ 10. And the question is pretty simple. Where does your conviction for Web3 come from?
Yeah, for me, it's very clear. Like the thing that like, let me give you two examples of things that I've experienced firsthand in Web2 that make me really bullish on Web3. So one thing, when I was at Facebook, we were trying to launch a game at Facebook and Apple just said no. We were trying to launch like a gaming app and Apple, we went through the review process and Apple just didn't approve it. So we had to shut that team down. When I was at Coinbase, I tried to launch a feature on the wallet that allowed you to like purchase NFTs in the app. And Apple pushed back on that. We didn't allow us to release it. And Apple told us like we couldn't actually let you purchase NFTs and we had to like add a link to Etherscan or something like that. And so these were two like very visceral moments for me because I clearly knew, oh, I can improve the experience of my customers if I did this. And then Apple goes, no, you can't, right? And this is the nature of a permissioned society, a permissioned tech ecosystem where you have to ask for somebody's permission to do something. And obviously, in a system like that, you have a lot of gatekeepers that can just tell you no. And so what I'm really, really excited about in Web3 is this idea of like permissionlessness, where, you know, if things are on the blockchain, you can just like write your own contracts or write your own code on the blockchain that it can interact with other people's codes that are already in the blockchain without asking them for permission, right? So in this world, in the ideal case, like the best idea wins. And I really, really like that potential because then I can just sit there and try to think about if I can come up with the best product idea and the best distribution idea, then I can outcompete or win against like even bigger incumbents. And we've seen this with like Blur versus OpenSea, right? Where like Blur is able to get 50% of NFT market share in a very short time just because they had a better distribution strategy. And I think the fact that that opportunity exists in this space, I think it's big. And I'm excited about that.
Well, AJ, now we've reached a point in the podcast where I'm going to ask you the GRTiQ 10. These are 10 questions I ask each guest of the podcast every week. They become a favorite of mine. I know a lot of listeners enjoy it. And I do it because it allows us to get to know you just a little bit better. But it also might inspire listeners to learn something new, try something different, or achieve more in their own life. So, AJ, are you ready for the GRTiQ 10?
Let's do it.
The GRTiQ 10. This is the way.
10 questions for astronauts floating in space.
This is the way.
What book or article has had the most impact on your life?
I think Dale Carnegie's like How to Win Friends and Influence People. I read at a very young age, and I found it very helpful. Just to like, it's a basic life skill, how to like meet people and like make friends. And so that's I think it's changed my entire life since I was a kid.
Is there a movie or a TV show that you would recommend everybody should watch?
Ooh, that's a good one. I think one that I've really watched a lot of times recently, it's Dune. Not for any particular reason. I just think it's like very well thought out, very detailed expression. And I don't know, I just find a lot of nuggets in there every time I watch.
How about this one? If you could only listen to one music album for the rest of your life, which one would you choose?
If you give me the option to say an artist, it would be Bobby McFerrin. He makes jazz music and it's just like the purest, like all his songs are just bring me peace.
What's the best life advice someone's ever given to you?
Don't try to do everything. If you were dead, things will move on. My mom gave me that advice.
What's one thing you've learned in your life that you don't think most other people have learned or know quite yet?
Everything you want is on the other side of fear. So courage is extremely important because most times that's where you find success, by facing your deepest fears.
What's the best life hack you've discovered for yourself?
You can get whatever you want if you just ask. And so a lot of times we shut down ourselves when we could have just asked. It's very simple. Like, hey, can I have that? And most times people actually will say yes. Just ask.
AJ, based on your own experiences and observations in life, what's that one habit or characteristic that you think best explains how or why people find success in life?
I think it's 100% discipline. I think when you study really successful people, you realize they've come up with the whole routine where they wake up at a certain time, they do a certain thing for certain hours, whether they are happy, sad, depressed, exhilarated, they just sit there and do the work. And I think that's just pure discipline. And I think that's what sets people that end up being very successful apart.
So AJ, the final three questions then are complete the sentence type questions. The first one is, the thing that most excites me about Web3 is?
Permissionlessness.
And how about this one? If you're on X, formerly Twitter, you should be following?
Web3 AJ. I'm shilling myself here. You got to follow Web3 AJ.
And I'll put a link in the show notes for anybody that wants a shortcut to that. And then how about the final question? I'm happiest when?
I'm with my family. My family brings me a lot of joy, a lot of peace. And so I love to spend time with them.
The GRTiQ 10.
And I show you how deep the
Podcast.
AJ, thank you so much for joining the GRTiQ podcast. It was a thrill to meet you in San Francisco, and I'm glad I had the opportunity to meet with you today. You shed a lot of really cool perspective and insight, not only on Web3 and your personal journey, but this vision for Astronaut and what you hope to accomplish there. If listeners want to learn more about you, stay up to date on the things you're working on, learn more about Astronaut, what's the best way to get started?
Yeah, the best way to connect with me is you can go to my website at ayoolajohn.com. So that's AYOOLA JOHN.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at Web3AJ. And that's also a good place to hit me up, or Telegram at Web3AJ as well.
This has been a production of the GRTiQ podcast. For more information, including detailed show notes, visit grtiq.com/podcast. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review.
GRTiQ
Podcast.